Welcome, everyone. Glad you could all join us this midsummer day, really. I hope you're all having a great summer. And thank you all for coming today. It's a popular topic, and we're so happy to have Mariana with us today to talk about these issues and hopefully have a great discussion here. So my name is Ken Levinson. I'm the Executive Director of the North American Passive House Network and want to welcome you all on behalf of Passive House Rocky Mountains, of which this is really coming from. Mariana is a member of NAPHN and Passive House Rocky Mountains, and there's a great active chapter there that if you are in the area, you want to be a part of. NAPHN has chapters across the country. We're affiliated with the International Passive House Association and the Passive House Institute. And it's really about global knowledge sharing, which I think many of us here can appreciate and what keeps us all coming back for more. We want to do a quick shout out to our sponsors, our growing number of sponsors who are very grateful for all that they do in supporting our work and efforts. It would not be possible without them. And we have many announcements. There's a lot going on, but I really want to focus on the upcoming courses that we have happening in new courses. We have a Passive House retrofit series that's starting out live online. Will be part 1 on August 18th. Which is really exciting. Retrofit's another huge topic and super important. The on-demand CPHD is accepting folks right now, and for the October exam, we're accepting people up to August 6th. So if you're thinking about it, now is the time to jump in the next week before that gate closes. It is on demand, but it has to be done in a rhythm to hit certain targets to make sure that you're prepared to take and pass the exam and become a certified passive house designer. We have thermal bridging on-demand course coming online in the next week. And today it just went live and we need to announce it properly, is the PHPP course on demand as well. So a lot more happening there around education and looking to grow that as we go. As I was mentioning, Passive House Rocky Mountains, it stretches from New Mexico all the way up through the Continental Divide to Idaho. Just amazing projects and practitioners there, so much to learn. And encourage you to be active in that area if you are there. So this talk today on the pitching passive and the issues around that is one that's always on everybody's topic. You know, the conversation always starts with, oh my gosh, the passive house name brand, what do we do with that? And how do we answer these questions? And how do we position things? And you ask 10 people and you get 10 different answers. Well, today we're really happy to have Mariana here because she really has spent a lot of time and years thinking about this, working in the industry as a co-founder of EMU, as a leader in the industry in the United States and North America and around the world, frankly. She's really passionate about what she does. You'll hear it in her voice, and I'm sure you've seen her present before. And we're really looking forward to having a great conversation. So she'll do a presentation. You know, we're thinking it'll be about 40 minutes. We'll see. There will be some back and forth during. We'll have a conversation when she's done and include a bunch of the questions that you've all hopefully asked along the way, and hopefully wrap it up on the hour at the close. So with that, I will stop sharing and take it away, Mariana.
Great, thank you. Let me share my screen real quick. Y'all let me know if you can see that. We good?
Yes. Yeah, we're good.
Excellent. All right. So thank you for the intro, Ken. as he mentioned, I am pretty passionate about this, and those are pretty much the extent of my credentials. I am not, my disclaimer at the start of this is I'm not a marketing professional. I'm just a small business owner and work primarily in Passive House and have done for a very long time. So I wanted to kind of share with you my experiences over the past decade or so, get some of your feedback because I'm always learning and I would love to learn more. And, I think this is a really pertinent topic right now as Passive House is kind of hitting what feels like this tipping point of really being able to reach out to mainstream construction. It's really important we talk about how we communicate it, how we assess the value of Passive House. So just to introduce myself a little bit more, again, I'm Chief EMU and co-founder of EMU. Our mission as a company is to close the gap between mainstream construction practices and proven building science. And our vision, which is important, which you'll see later in my presentation, is a future where Passive House building codes are the industry standard for mainstream construction. And that vision really drives a lot of what we do. And hopefully, you will find through the rest of this presentation that vision can drive all of your marketing and communications around the value of Passive House. So we do that through a variety of things. We offer training. We're an accredited education provider with PHI. We partner with organizations like NAPHN to offer the CPHT, the tradesperson training for builders. And there is another course with NAPHN coming up, I believe in September about that, which we can put links up to at some point. And then we also offer a range of services all around people, products, and projects that are certifying for Passive House. And we have a pilot program geared towards helping builders kind of access more standardized building science construction details. And I mention all this also because I want to just point out everything we do in our company, our whole business model is passive. And that was a conscious decision that we made at some point along the road, which we'll talk about in a minute. Colorado. So I wanted to kind of just give a little bit more context as to where my experiences come from. We started as a company in Northern Italy as an architecture studio. After Enrico Bonilauri and I, my co-founder, we had done our master's degree at the University of Sydney in Australia, and started a studio in his hometown in Italy and did that for about 8 years. And we really felt like we weren't making enough impact on the market. We found Passive House as a standard pretty early on, adopted it as our internal benchmark, and really wanted to have more impact on helping our colleagues remove hurdles for them to get to Passive House, which is why in around 2016, 17, we moved the company to Colorado and left behind architectural design and really started focusing more on just Passive House specialization. How can we help people through education and services toward that? Colorado was picked for a number of reasons, but that map that's up there right now, like basically when we first got here, there were not a lot. This is the map of CPHTs trained in the United States, certified CPHTs in the United States. And this is a current map, all those red dots, and there's tons more now, which is fantastic. But when we first moved to Colorado, Middle America was just vacant, which was upsetting. But Colorado as a spot had a lot of really interesting things about it. For example, the startup scene. And this may be something that folks outside of Denver don't know as well, or folks on the East Coast, but the startup culture in Denver is really quite robust. There are tons of tech companies located here now. There's a lot of resources for entrepreneurs who are looking for kind of incubators, accelerators, different types of programs to really help you zero in on your target market, your message, how you're scaling, how you're growing. And so I've really tried to take advantage of a lot of those as a business owner over the past few years. They have a free event every year here called Denver Startup Week, which has some amazing speakers. I was when I first got to Colorado, I applied to a program called Traction, which was a little business accelerator based out of Golden, Colorado. And that was where we really kind of refined this business model of focusing solely on passive and using education to help do that. We then, I was accepted into the Hyper Accelerator program by the Rockies Venture Club, which is an angel investor group here in Denver. And that was intense. It's kind of a week-long smush all of business school into 1 week and then end it with a Shark Tank style pitch deck situation that was a little bit nerve-wracking, if I'm being honest. And for me, it was fantastic because I didn't have that business background. It really kind of got all of that in one go for me. And then the past couple of years, we've been working with the advisors at Innosphere, which is an accelerator out of Fort Collins in Northern Colorado, where I live now. And they're really focused more on kind of helping small businesses look at growth and scale and that kind of a thing. So I think Colorado is interesting for that, but in the full context of marketing and communication that we're talking about today, it's also really interesting mentality here. There's a lot of remnants of the passive solar design movement from the 70s and 80s. Amory Levin's house is up in the mountains here. There's a lot of kind of just culture around the idea of living in symbiosis with the land. And it's in this fantastic way that's super Colorado to me, where there's this spectrum that's almost like a circle, where you've got these kind of left wing hippies that are really into living off grid to save the planet. And it almost kind of meets up with the right wing off grid mountain cowboys that are prepping for the apocalypse. And so passive kind of sits in the middle of that as this amazing thing that can help all of these people reach that goal, right? And so I kind of love that about Colorado. And then the last thing about it is that we're pretty fortunate, after really hot and humid summers and really cloudy winters in northern Italy, kind of the worst design case scenario ever. We cut our teeth in that. And then here it's beautiful. It's an absolutely beautiful climate for showcasing the best of Passive House, cold climate, but solar access. And so that's been pretty exciting, even though, we still work nationally and internationally. Having this as our home base is really great to be able to show some really cool projects. So let's get started. So today, I've got kind of 4 things that I'd like to go through, and depending on our audience, I was trying to kind of get a feel. I didn't recognize tons of names, so I was intending to go a little bit quicker through the ones at the end, but I might spend a little longer on it, since I'm not sure if everyone knows those things already. But first, we'll start with just kind of the anatomy of a pitch, and this is, again, I'm just sharing my experiences over the learning that I've done over the past few years through the startup culture here in Denver. There's lots of ways to go about educating yourself more on those resources. I put down in the corner of the slide the Golden Circle by Simon Sinek, which is possibly the most cited thing in the startup world. But if you haven't seen his TED Talk, you should. It's really, it start with the why. It's a whole summary of how a why should really, the vision should really inform the rest of your business model and your marketing and your communications around that. And then we'll talk a little bit about, I called it slow marketing here, but really just kind of the ethics and responsibility, I think, around how we communicate passive. Then I will jump into just some of the typical unique value adds that Passive House can offer. And for those of you who've been in passive for a while, these might be rinse and repeat kind of things, but it's really important that we're all on the same page about them, and that we, can pull these out very easily to talk about the value and the benefits of Passive House over other things. And then lastly, kind of questions to expect. So this is just me writing down some of the most typical things that, concerns, objections, suggestions that people ask when they're thinking about going passive, and how I've responded to them in the past. Throughout all this, I'd love if you guys, have additional ones that I'm forgetting, add them to the chat. Ken's going to keep an eye on that for me and we'll digest that at the end. Or if you've got suggestions of other ways, that I'm not mentioning that would be good to respond to these issues, please also join in and let us learn from you. So let's get started. So the anatomy of a pitch, there are tons of graphics and visualizations of how to organize your pitch deck in the startup world. usually it starts with this problem statement, and then what is your specific solution? What is your unique value add, target market, the team that you're going to do it with, and what is your ask? I really like this kind of visualization a little bit better because, as I was saying earlier, I think it's important to talk about the why rather than the problem. Why is this person sitting in front of you asking you about Passive House? And that really gets to the meat of the whole thing. Who are you talking to? I think, my lesson over these years owning this business is just really know who you're talking to. You're going to have a different pitch if you're talking to a builder that's thinking about getting into Passive House versus a realtor that's thinking about learning more about it versus a homeowner that maybe wants to live in a Passive House. These are all very different conversations. So I like this because it really, we start with thinking about the person's why. Then we jump to the how. How are we going to solve that for them? How are we going to address their why? And then really taking them down that story of your vision. And ultimately getting up to this, this summit of the aha moment where you're up there at the top of the mountain with them, looking at all this going, I can't imagine that it was ever any other way. And I put a little fine print on the downslope there. There are some logistics, obviously, and hopefully on the trip down the mountain, you are not ruining the experience of being on the summit, but you're instead reinforcing things with details. So that's kind of, I don't know, that's how I think about it. So the first thing is identifying the why correctly. And that seems simple, but it's really actually possibly the hardest thing. I wrote up there, your problem is not everyone's problem. Practice empathy. This is hard for some people, and it's something you have to practice. Definitely. It's something you learn over time, and it involves a lot of listening. And every single person, every stakeholder in the Passive House process is going to have a different why. So I just kind of brainstormed a few up here. This is a great opportunity. If you guys have other ones you want to pop in chat, this would be a great spot to do that. But for example, a homeowner might be thinking, oh, I've got allergies or chemical sensitivities or something. A designer might be thinking, oh, I need to design for comfort because that's how I'm marketing my services. A builder could be concerned about liability or risk, durability of a building. A realtor could be worried about actually just selling it. How do I sell this? A developer could be worried about the ROI, the future proofing of their investment. And a manufacturer might be worried about the validity of a product they want to put on the market. So these were just ones that I brainstormed really quick. But honestly, for each stakeholder or each person that you're talking to about passive, they've probably got a whole list of whys. And what's important is really asking them which ones are most important to them and what level of priority, basically. Once you do that, it's pretty great. This quote is a Steve Jobs quote, I think. If you define the problem correctly, you almost have the solution. That's true, you do. So for example, I have allergies. Well, Passive House very easily solves that with the indoor air quality features of Passive House. I need to design for thermal comfort or for comfort. So thermal comfort is something that Passive House deals with on a performance basis. Quality assurance will address liability concerns of builders. There's, the verification that comes with certification can assuage a lot of those fears. Measurable performance is something that helps assign actual dollars to value of things. And in this presentation, I won't go so deep into that. We cover a lot of that in our unit 2 of our course for builders. But I find that I'm going to run out of time if I don't do a more high level thing right now. But and then future-proofing your investment. The resiliency of Passive House is something to talk about in that case. And third-party validation, component certification offers that research-backed verification of those products. So again, once you zero in on like what this person is concerned about, Passive House is one of these wonderful things that kind of addresses all of those in certain ways. And then it's really just about being able to confidently point to how Passive House addresses those through solutions. The next thing is taking them down this, this vision. An exercise that I really thought was good when I was doing some of the startup camps here in Colorado was that they had us either write or, voice record yourself telling a story about this vision that you want to see. Imagine yourself 50 years from now, 20 years from now, whatever it is. What is it that you envision this future to look like in ideal circumstances? So I have this one that I wrote here that, you guys can hopefully read it if you want in your time, but it's a lofty vision of a future in America where mainstream construction standards are derived from Passive House research-based science. And policymakers are aware of the impact that has on people, and architecture and engineering schools are basing their curriculum on human health and occupant behavior, and building codes are based on prevention of mold and condensation and indoor air quality, things like that. And so you kind of just dump and ramble all of this vision that you see in the future, and then they had us really refine that down and down and down and distill it into one sentence. And I think the ability to come back to that one sentence as an organization, as a team, just me as a person, when I'm talking to somebody, we are super clear on that vision, and therefore all the other answers become a lot easier. Then you start your stuff. So, a lot of the pitch deck startup things will say, what is your unique value add? Why is it that you are positioned to be able to offer Passive House in a particularly applicable way to what their why is? So if the why has more to do with indoor air quality and you have specific background in mechanical ventilation, that would be a really big value add, right? If their why has to do with product certification and your value add is, hey, actually, there are only a few people in the United States certifying products and we're one of them, then that's a great thing to be able to communicate. Sometimes it's experience, sometimes it's education. It could be that you have particular facilities or tools that that you've invested in, that software or something that are worth communicating, or your team, or you are able to work with budgets better than anyone else. And so once you have taken them down this path of why and how and what the vision is, you really bring it home by saying, here's what I'm here to help you with on that particular thing. So again, this is just kind of the overview of how startup pitch decks, encourage us to think about making a sales pitch like this. The last thing I would say that I think is probably the hardest is then sticking to your guns on stuff. And this is where, we made a conscious decision in 2016, 17 that we wanted to be an all passive business. We only wanted to deal with Passive House as our internal benchmark for everything. And there's obviously varying levels of flexibility as to how much a company or a business or an individual can pull that off. And I understand that. However, I will say that when you clearly communicate that line in the sand and say, this is something we're passionate about, this is our vision, and this is what we're going to do from now on, those are the clients you get. And that's a great feeling. And this kind of feeds into my second big topic that I wanted to talk about, which is I wrote slow marketing. When I lived in Italy, I was really into the slow food movement. I actually went and Googled around to see if slow marketing was a term that actually existed. And it looks like somebody wrote some manifesto back on like 2017 or 18, and then it quickly disappeared from the internet, and the domain is no longer active. And so I'm guessing that marketing professionals decided that slow was not the way to go. But I do think that it's worth talking about from the perspective of any multifaceted product like Passive House. There's a lot of beauty to that. And we can oversimplify it sometimes and forget that. And we can be encouraged to oversimplify it. And that's also upsetting. I think this is kind of where I was using the term ethics or responsibility. I had a really interesting conversation with a very curious realtor here in Fort Collins last week, who reminded me that, it's really what we're doing is really also asking the client to come up and meet us and put in some skin in the game and educate themselves a little bit. And that's okay. And, there's Daniel Kahneman is this Nobel Prize winning economist and psychologist. He wrote this book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which I highly recommend. It's excellent. This quote says, "We think, each of us, that we're much more rational than we are. And we think that we make our decisions because we have good reasons to make them, even when it's the other way around. We believe in the reasons because we've already made the decision." And I think a lot of times traditional marketing, and I'm speaking from a novice position on this, obviously, but I do think it caters to that tendency of humans to want everything distilled down into the easiest digestible format. I mean, I can't tell you how many times people ask, well, could you just make it simple? Could you just give me like one sentence? Can you just give me like one page to give people? Can you make it, easier to digest and faster to understand? Well, we can definitely simplify things, but no, like there are a lot of factors that go into Passive House, and that's okay. And we encourage you to learn more about that in order to understand that. The other kind of side of this responsibility is something that, is coming up in all kinds of industries, and is just the checking your sources, right? And check them a million times. In building science, especially right now, I think, I've been discouraged by some of the building science available on YouTube and online in general. A lot of it is not necessarily from academics or science-based research. It's really in that tradition of construction. You have to remember that construction industry primarily has this build it, learn, build it again kind of approach. I often make the comparison with the aerospace industry. They don't build a plane and then see if the plane flies, and then build a different plane with a little bit of a difference to it. That would be ridiculous. They model it. And it's ridiculous, in my opinion, that the construction industry still operates this way. It's the 21st century. We have all the tools we need to be able to model these things and simulate aging and rain infiltration and all kinds of things. It just requires the education and the impetus to do that. And so I think expressing caution and using caution when sharing things and communicating things can't be done enough. And then, finally, you don't know what you don't know, obviously. So in my opinion, it's your responsibility to go learn it. I love learning it. And I think that the most effective marketing, communications, the most effective stories that are told, I think always come from a position of education, and could be because I'm daughter of two teachers, but that's kind of always been my thought towards this. So up here, I just put a little mention of the green addendum, which is something that a lot of people don't know about, especially from the finance side of things, realtors, appraisers. The green addendum is an addition to the American Appraisal Institute's process for assessing value on buildings. And that's definitely something, if that's the world that you're coming from and that's the direction you're approaching Passive House from, you should know about that. And there are courses to go learn about that and workshops and so that's kind of the responsibility side of it that I was referring to. All right, time is it? We're good. Okay, so I wanted to kind of briefly run through, to me, these are, I've said them so many times that they seem kind of obvious. And so I don't know if this is going to be in your face kind of things for you, or if this is going to be brand new. So I'll just try to approach it as if it's new. We all know that thick walls are sexy, right? In Passive House, we know that thick walls are sexy. expressing the value of insulation is a pretty hard thing to do. The passive house world uses the thermos versus the electric coffee maker that has a continuous source of energy coming into it as this kind of quintessential example that pops up everywhere of what insulating your building does, right? It helps you maintain the heat longer, maintain the cold longer. You can kind of make it more Colorado by looking at coolers or Yeti coolers or a water bottle or something like that. But, relating the concept of super insulation to something that makes sense to a person on an everyday basis, super important. I will say though, this is, in my experience, one of the least kind of convincing motivators for people. For good or for bad, Americans don't really care about, they'll say they care about energy efficiency, but when it comes down to, the monthly bill versus return on investment to do passive, blah, 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 energy efficiency, in my opinion, has been one of the weaker things to try to use to convince folks that passive house is worth it. There's much more meat behind this message that we use all the time at ENU. It's in all of our training and all of our presentations. Buildings are for people. We forget this a lot of times. Buildings are for people. They are supposed to shelter us, keep us safe and healthy. In America, we spend 80 to 90% of our time indoors and a third of our life in one room, in the bedroom, sleeping. That bedroom better be good, right? But we're just used to being in crappy buildings. I think, this statistic, the average family spends blank years in a home before moving. This is something we ask our builder students when we're in training, just to kind of see what reaction we get. And pretty much consistently, most of the builders will say between 5 and 7 years. Oh, we stay in the building 5 to 7 years. When in reality, the latest research shows 13 years. And that was a statistic that came from the North American Home Builders Association a few years ago. And why that's important is because that totally reframes how we're communicating return on investment or value if you're thinking about the length of time someone's living in that house, right? And so that's always kind of, I think it's just an example of how we have preconceptions that reinforce what we think we're going to believe. And then, so on the theme of buildings being for people, I believe one of the biggest arguments for passive house and one of the biggest selling points for passive house is the indoor air quality argument. Again, if you start paying attention, we are just used to being in poor indoor air quality everywhere we go. It's upsetting. If you think about your bedroom, 160 square feet, 1,300 cubic feet of air in that bedroom. If you have no continuous mechanical ventilation, or, it's mid-season, you've got the windows closed, it's not cold enough for heating to kick on, it's not warm enough for air conditioning to kick on, you've got a fan going maybe, but you close the door because you've got kids and your bedroom's closed. That's all the air you have that night. 2 people will use all that oxygen up in 30 minutes. And then your brain goes into like anaerobic state. There's all kinds of health things that are associated with this. And this is kind of normal. We do this a lot. A lot of people do this. And we just trust in our, typical HVAC thermostats to kick on when they need to, and not thinking about the fresh air factor. That's a really easy way to kind of get somebody who's not really thought about passive house to think about this as a direction. The second way is thermal comfort. Again, we're used to being uncomfortable, unfortunately. When you go into a passive house or passive house building, remember, house is a misnomer. It can be any kind of building, right? Just basics there. But when you go into a passive building and in the middle of winter and you sit down next to the window and don't feel cold, that's when you really get it. The human body cannot process more than 7 degrees temperature difference, or it can process it, but it's very uncomfortable. That's when we start to feel discomfort. So in this example, it's showing, 15 degrees outside. This is for the Colorado climate zone 5, this example, but the math could be done for other ones as well. But and in a typical code code accepted window, you would sit next to the window and feel cold inside. And that's building to code, that's acceptable. With passive house level windows, that does not happen. The thermal consistency in the room is notable. You feel the same temperature no matter where you are in the building. And that can be a really good way to sell, especially when you're talking to homeowners that have just poured a ton of money into a custom build, and then they end up feeling cold inside their own home right after it's been constructed. A lot of them have had that experience before. So this is a good thing to mention. And the windows, just a quick note, windows are everything in passive house. So for those of you who haven't done any training with passive yet, windows will make or break a project. So when you're approaching, if you're thinking about pitching the passive house to a new client and you're an architect, for example, I always tell architects and designers, you make sure that that client is on board with the windows, because if they're not on board with the fact that the windows are going to cost more than typical windows, and you may have fewer options depending on your climate zone, if they're not on board with that from the beginning, you can very easily not reach certification because of it. And the colder the more extreme your climate zone, the more that matters. Okay. And then another thing is just passive survivability and resilience. So passive survivability is apparently the new term that AIA is using to replace resiliency. But the idea that a structure can recover from or adjust easily to changes. And this is a massively important thing that I think is tugging on more emotional heartstrings now more than ever, with climate change and wildfires and grid instability and all kinds of things. I mean, you look at all of the different areas, the thing in Texas, my mom's house down in Texas was subject to that, where the grid went down for a period of time. The big value add that passive house has is this time constant. It's called a time constant. It gives you resiliency from the grid. So you don't need additional heat. You don't need additional cooling. It maintains that thermal comfort for a lot longer period of time than would a typical structure. In our training, we show that to the builders by having them build these passive pods. Each team builds a pod to the passive standards based on a bunch of different products that we get donated. And then we also have a code pod. And then we wheel them all outside, leave them out overnight. And you can see that the top lines are all the passive pods that maintained their heat throughout the night, even though the temperature is down here below freezing. That's the orange line at the bottom. And this gray line in the middle there, that's the code pod, which immediately plummeted down to freezing. And, this is a micro example of how that would work in the real world. Obviously, we use it for training, but you can see that everywhere in the news whenever there's a blizzard or a problem. The immediate concern is safety of people in houses and buildings that can't be resilient. I'm close on time here, so I'm going to hurry up. Another value add to discuss, especially with builders, is reduced liability and reduced risk because of the verification and the quality assurance and sequencing that happens in passive house. It builds up a lot of protection against that. Lastly, the invisible is now visible. Our consumers have a lot more awareness about this stuff, and homeowners can very reasonably purchase gadgets that attach to their phone to look at thermal bridging, or where you've missed insulation, or indoor air quality monitors that can tell them how bad the air is in their buildings. This last section, I'll breeze through it real quick because hopefully you guys can add some more to chat on this and we can address them in conversation instead. But I tried to brainstorm just some of the questions and concerns that come up. Typically, will it cost more? Will it take more time? Will it be another hurdle? Will it matter to people? Will it pay off soon? And will it be profitable? The biggest one that always comes up is cost, as Ken mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. And my response on that is always, well, how do you define value in the built environment? What is the ROI of eating organic food? What is the cost of not going to the gym? Why are those things important to you? Nutrition Exercise, those are two of the building blocks towards our own health, our body health. But the third, I argue, would be the built environment. So we should care about that just as much. So how do we value that? How much money do we spend on respiratory illnesses, healthcare each year? Healthcare is not going down in the United States anytime soon as far as cost. People often ask, is just applying some of the principles of passive, is that enough? Incremental application. Well, I would encourage you to look into the terminology of that and really think about the value of certification. It's a benchmark to reach. It's someone verifying that you have met a performance standard. If you start chopping that down, it's like earlier when we talked about vision. If you start walking back from that line you drew in the sand and compromising certain little elements of your vision, it's a slippery slope, right? And then who knows, what is it then? It's almost passive. So which parts of it did you do or not do? And which parts are you protected against or not protected against? This article on hows I wrote a while ago might be a good thing to direct people towards, just kind of simple breakdown of terminology. Same lines, net zero. It's important to remember net zero is an energy balance. It's compensation for consumption, not conservation. It has nothing to do with air quality, nothing to do with thermal comfort. And PASFAS is an excellent pathway to achieve net zero with fewer resources. And that is a huge argument. People often ask what the actual difference in air tightness is. There is a substantial difference, and you start assigning numbers to that and people can understand that a little bit better. You could easily make this a much more pleasant graphic. And can any builder do passive? I always say, yes, any builder can do passive. It's caring is all it is. It's pride and craft and caring and putting the tape in the right place, not the wrong place, cutting the insulation well instead of not. And, that given there are lots of issues with crews and skilled labor, and all of that is definitely of concern, but it comes down to attention to detail. That's all. People ask, this is the last thing, people ask about natural ventilation, and I would encourage you to ask them, are they in a polluted area? Are they in an area that has allergies and pollens? Are they in an area that's affected by wildfire smoke? That filter right there was 3 months in Reggio Emilia in the Po Valley, which is kind of a manufacturing area of Italy, 3 months on that filter. And even if they don't live near pollution, you need to remind folks that most of the indoor air quality problems we have actually come from inside the building, cooking and showering and household air pollution that comes from bringing in IKEA furniture and letting the VOCs go wild, things like that. So that's yet another argument for monitoring air quality via the PASFAS standard. So I'm going to stop. If you guys, as you can tell, there's a lot more that I could go into. There are a lot more details to this. Our unit 2 of our CPHT curriculum, if you know any builders that want to get involved with that, really dives more into some case studies, assigns some dollar values to these things. We have a newsletter we send out every month, and I put our handles up there. We put a bunch of geeky stuff on Instagram and things like that. Happy to chat with anyone more about this stuff afterwards, but I will bring it to a close right now so that we can address some questions.
Great. Thank you, Mariana. That's terrific. Terrific presentation covering a lot of ground. And if folks have questions, please put them in. Some interesting comments in the chat along the way as well. It's such a complex issue to relate and to try to sell and to try to boil down, and this sort of creative tension maybe in trying to simplify the messaging and bring it down to that sentence, and then trying to appreciate the nuance, trying to empathize and understand where people are coming from. But then they're also reluctant often too, right? There are very few people that are just, totally enthusiastic and are willing to just take the plunge. And I'm wondering, in your experience, how you navigate that, finding, where those points are of connection, addressing the reluctance, and it can obviously be around cost and certainly the exercise and the meals, the vacations, what's the ROI in your last big trip?
Mhm.
You know, I don't know, just a little bit, if you go into a little bit in how you think about that dance of.
So again, I think if you approach anyone with empathy as the main goal, everyone is trying to communicate to you a problem they've got or a concern they have. And it really comes down to priorities. And I typically, I think something that I do that potentially is not, I don't chase every single lead we've got, because some of them clearly don't have the priorities in place for Passive House to make sense. And so I think that the biggest thing that I do is try to figure out what their actual priorities are. If the priorities are health driven, then I talk a lot more about that. And that's almost an easy thing to do, because if that's actually the priorities for folks, Passive House is just an obvious, it's an obvious solution to that. When it comes to cost, it's usually not just cost. It's usually justification for cost. So then I try to ask, okay, it's not that you don't want to spend extra money on this thing. It's that you need to feel like it's good value to do that. And I want to clarify really quick here too. This is where who you're talking to and what project you're talking about matters a lot, right? So as far as the economics of Passive House, it's been shown that you can easily meet the Passive House standard for larger volumes at cost parity with market value buildings. So especially multifamily, we've got a lot of case studies of multifamily homes or multifamily buildings where the cost of going passive is not more than what it would have been if they had met regular building code. For single family homes, it's a little bit more tricky conversation because there's less volume, more envelope per that volume. And that envelope typically has lots of windows, and the windows are an expensive thing. And so there is typically a little bit more capital cost to that, like 5 to 10% is what I usually kind of say, but obviously depends. There's a wild swing on that in custom residential, because if you just think about the breakdown of the economic drivers or the cost drivers of a house, some people import tiles from Italy, and some people have to have that granite countertop. I mean, finishes can account for 20 to 30% of a budget sometimes. That has nothing to do with passive. So are you attributing that to an extra cost? If you look at, in New York where you are, Ken, a lot of Passive House professionals have a little bit easier time pitching windows, because in New York, you want to keep the noise out, you want to keep the dust out, you want to keep the pests out, you want a tight envelope, you want mechanical ventilation for a lot of reasons that are just being in a big city. So right. You attribute those costs to being an extra Passive House cost. It's the story that you tell about the data that you're showing them. So what we try to tell our builders is look at that budget and try to communicate to them where the value of each of those things is.
Yeah, and it's interesting, the different projects, there's like different pressure points for the costs, like what you're saying with the single family homes and windows clearly could be really sticker shock and have to really be creative to deal with that from a design perspective, perhaps. But in the big multifamilies where it's near cost parity, if not quite there, typically, there's always a question about certification. Like they want to spend the money on certification. How do you convince them?
Which is crazy. The cost.
So how do you get to the?
Yeah. You froze a little bit at the end for me.
Sorry,
I don't know if that was just
choppy.
Yeah, but I think I understood what you're saying. And yeah, basically, the balking at the certification costs to me is always kind of like, why? It is a drop in the bucket after all of the effort you have gone to. And if you're actually
and now there's
this, then show that you're doing it and give your building a little bit more resiliency in the market over time by giving it that stamp of approval that it's actually been checked.
Right, and the research is showing that the certification really closes any sense of performance gap.
Yeah, and that's something to mention that a lot of people don't realize. performance gap. So performance gap is the gap between how a building is simulated to perform and how it actually performs. And that performance gap issue became a big thing with LEED a while ago because there was a big performance gap between what they expected these things to do and what they actually did at the platinum level and such. Passive House, of all the green building things that are out there, has one of the lowest performance gaps, one of the narrowest performance gaps, because there's such an emphasis on that early planning and simulating to make sure that the as-built is going to be as close as possible to that.
Right. And costs, I mean, it all comes back to cost again and again. And Lloyd in the comments made the interesting example of, nobody would pay for airbags if they had the choice. Maybe an overstatement, but
yes. Okay. And this is where
you give people the choice.
Yeah. And this is where policy stuff comes in, which is a whole other interesting topic. But, airbags, yeah, okay. If you give people the choice to pay for an airbag or not, maybe they wouldn't. But we don't give them that choice because it's a basic safety. We've decided as a society that this is something that's basic to the safety of humans. Yet we haven't decided that for mold and condensation and things that cause respiratory distress and things that can cause cancer. And that's shocking to me, but it's just kind of the way that building codes have developed in a siloed fashion over time. They'll get there eventually, hopefully, but it's much slower to respond to that. Whereas, the comparison between construction industry and the automobile industry comes up a lot in Passive House, because if we had anywhere near the same kind of standardization and safety protocols in construction that we did in automobiles, we would be using Passive House as the base building code for everything.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think there's a pretty strong consensus that you don't want to lead with energy efficiency and you don't want to lead with kind of the science, the nuts and bolts of it, that you want to lead with comfort and health and these things that are kind of more emotional and people can relate to in a more visceral way. I'm interested, what do you think about, I love the Daniel Kahneman quote, and kind of like everybody's in their own bubble of rationalization, right? That you end up at a decision, of course, because everything aligns to be that. And I don't know, there's this tension with the Passive House world talking to the non-Passive House world about, adoption and becoming, buying, operating in, being practitioners of Passive House, mandating Passive House, and how do you navigate that kind of psychology and make sure, I think, it goes to a number of things that you were talking about, I think, in terms of checking your sources and making sure you're in a good spot.
I typically come back to the aerospace analogy when I'm talking to, I end up talking to a lot of, construction professionals, typically older men who've been doing this for 40 years and they know more than me. And, and there's a lot of that to deal with as well. And I understand the sensitivities about, I have built this thing this way a number of times and I've seen how this performs. I'm comfortable with that. And there's an inclination because the built environment is such a hands-on, culturally and psychologically, these are people that want to see something in their hands as proof, and reliance on simulations, it doesn't come naturally. And so I think the construction industry is going through that kind of tech revolution thing way later than a lot of other industries, and a little bit slower than a lot of other industries. If you look at Contech, in the startup world, they call it Contech, the construction technology startups, right? Like FinTech, but Contech. The Contech companies out there are all focused on how to make it faster, cheaper, and easier to build. They're not looking at quality of construction at all. None of them are looking at building science. And that's concerning. I think it's a real thing for sure. And when I talk to construction professionals who are inclined to say, well, I'm not really into the idea of certification, but maybe I'll use parts of this. Usually I say, okay, well, you know what? In my opinion, when, I'm going to learn something, I want to learn the best practice, learn all the things about it that research says are the best way to do stuff, and then pick and choose about what I want to apply. And they agree with that. Okay. So you agree that, you should get trained and at least know all this stuff. And then you can pick, you don't have to certify every building passive, but you cannot unlearn it. You can't unlearn how to do air sealing correctly. You can't unlearn the why behind the building science. I mean, that's why we focus on teaching the why and the physics of it rather than a specific product, because you can't unlearn it. And once they learn it, the passive house just makes sense. It's just, right. I can't tell you how many post-course evaluations the builders say, I don't know. It seems like common sense, and it's a lot more simple than I thought it would be. It's really simplifying things.
I think that's a great place to kind of end it, in the sense that, a point that you made related to that earlier, challenging yourself to learn what you need to learn to bring to the table. You're challenging your potential clients, whoever you're selling passive to, policymakers, owners, contractors, to learn with you along with it. And that it isn't about being able to find the silver bullet, the line, that there is going to be this slow cooking process of education and conversation, and relationship building. And ultimately, I think something that's, I think, is very attractive to people, and or at least I imagine it is to me, where folks have made the decision to just do passive, and how do they make that work, and what are the situations. And I think that's maybe a good panel discussion for another time, and see the ups and downs of that.
Yeah, definitely.
So great presentation. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And look forward to our next NAPHN event. NAPHN Live probably won't be until September, as August, everybody tends to go poof. But it's great to see everyone here today. Thank you again. Thank you for coming. And please check out our courses, EMU's courses, a lot of great stuff happening. Have a great day.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.